Okay, so the news is out that USA Rugby gets the next green light in terms of producing a bid for the 15s Rugby World Cup for 2027 men, 2029 women, 2031 men. Any or two of those, they're going to do the bid. So the story is on Golf Rugby Report, but there's more to it, right? It's like that's a big deal. That's all condensed down from a 170-page feasibility study. We got more to say about that. But first, I want to first of all thank our patrons, our Patreon patrons, and our anonymous patrons for supporting Golf Rugby Report. Basically, one of the ways that we get to do what we do is by generous donations of our readers. And what does that money go for? Well, there are a couple of major expenses that this helps with. Number one is web hosting and web maintenance. It's a major part of our expense because the more traffic we get, the more stuff we have to keep track of, and the more it costs to just host the website where it is. Second of all, travel. You've been around a lot of places, and even when I'm just driving, it's still a major expense in terms of obviously fuel, accommodation, all of those things. Very important. So much appreciated that people are supporting us, and you can do it too. And all you have to do is go to the website at the bottom of the screen, golfrugbyreport.com/support-grr. You find out how you can do it, and every little bit helps, but you can sign up to just support us for like $4 a month. And, you feel like you'd be doing a good thing, and I appreciate it, and it really helps. Now, Rugby World Cup. Well, I don't know about you, but I've not been really sold on this idea. It seems to me like it was not a great idea. Why? Because I think it's going to be very difficult for USA Rugby and rugby in general to break in through a very busy American sports schedule. I also looked at the Rugby World Cup Sevens and saw that USA Rugby ended up losing money, losing a large chunk of money. It really hurt them on that event. So, what do we do about that? What do we talk about that? Do we think that we get a mulligan on all of that stuff? It's going to be different this time. I'm suspicious about it, but I decided to go to USA Rugby CEO Ross Young and ask him about it and some other aspects of this. And it'll be really interesting to see what your reactions are as readers, but this is my conversation with Ross Young about the Rugby World Cup, the lessons learned, the scary parts, and some things that I know were a little bit of a surprise to me, might be a surprise to you.
Key thing we're talking about is the World Cup bid, the acceptance to be able to bid for it, I guess is how we would describe it, right? I mean, how do you feel about it, first of all, in terms of there's a little bit of, in the press release it says there's a little bit of validation there, right?
There is, and I think, what's good about this is, having been on both sides of the fence with World Rugby, previously they open a bidding window and all these people get excited and come in without really knowing the bid criteria, and you spend a lot of time, effort, and some of those unions spend a lot of money when once you get into the detail, doesn't really make it feasible. Right. So I think once the announcement was made from World Rugby at the end of the tournament in Japan in 2019, to go and put out there a 10-year pathway to give some certainty, to look at development opportunities for developing countries to potentially put their hand up. We started, and what I wanted to make sure is that we as a union did not get ourselves exposed to any unnecessary risk. And before we even started doing anything, we took the onus on ourselves to do a feasibility study. And so that started in August last year I've obviously been helping out, but that's been led by Jim Brown, who's widely regarded globally as a subject matter expert on major events. he pulled in a couple of key people he'd worked with before with Olympic and soccer World Cup experience. We've got a great team here like Calder and Brandy and Jonathan Atkinson now that obviously know the landscape, plus a bit of my Rugby World Cup knowledge. Sure. Is let's put together a team. The majority of the work done by the major event experts, and they're very much a sought after group of people, and we're lucky that the US has some real experts in that area. So let's get the groundwork done first, prior to entering this candidate phase. And then World Rugby in February opened up this dialogue, what they call the dialogue phase. So we were very quickly able to present them with a lot of the work that had been done in the feasibility study, which allowed them to go and audit and review, from technical capabilities to field size to how do you make it happen, just general venue configurations, broadcast compounds. Obviously in the US, we're blessed with a multitude of options, way more than any other country. So, we did a lot of that work, and then there's about 170 pages worth of documents we have to fill in for this stage, and then submit at the end of that dialogue phase that World Rugby would then almost did an auditing process with a number of calls, points of clarification, etc. And then having run through that process, decided to, if you like, validate the information we've given, and we've moved forward now into the more detailed candidate stroke bidding phase.
Good. There are some things in the feasibility that are patently obvious. You just have to put them down on paper and prove it. But we know the United States has the infrastructure, got the hotel capacity. We have the country, as you said, has the broadcast capacity, has venue capacity. There's a bunch of stuff that's like there's going to be no problem there. And transportation, things like that, just getting around, it's really easy, even if it's a huge country. The thing that jumps out at me is more, if you're going to host a men's 15s World Cup, and I realize that we'll talk on the fact that this isn't just about that, but men's 15s World Cup in September and October, you've got baseball still going, you've got the NFL, you've got college football going. So what did the feasibility study tell you guys about venue availability?
Great question, and you're 100% right. It tells us that it could be far more impactful and probably more profitable if it was hosted in a different window. I mean, we have to formulate the bid to allow World Rugby to do apples for apples comparison. It's obviously the way a bid process works, but we've been very open with them at the start that we'd like to look at innovations, look at what we're doing in the US because of the advantages we have. The opportunity to look at 24-team tournaments instead of a 20-team tournament from the men, look at increasing the size of the women's tournament also.
Sure.
Make the women's tournament, regional instead of just city-based as it's been previously. So, and I think that's been quite refreshing for them that we do have that opportunity, and we'll get stuck into that in more detail during this phase, and the dependent whether we get 27 or 31 gives us more flexibility to work on that. So if we're locked in at 27, that will come around pretty quickly, and will probably be the format of the tournament where it's going to be. It's probably going to be more traditional.
Right.
One of the advantages of potentially going for 31 is, from a men's perspective, is that we can use a few more of those innovations and push a bit harder for looking at windows and looking at number of teams and tournament formats, etc.
Okay, so a little bit asking World Rugby to bend a little bit.
Of course, we can do it and make it successful, but it's so much more successful if we do this.
Yeah. Do you think the NFL could be amenable to bending a little bit in terms of their schedule or something like that?
We've already we've already started reaching out, and Jim Brown, who's been the chair of this bid, is fortunate he's got great relationships with the role that he played as the managing director of the FIFA bid for the successful FIFA bid for 26. And everyone's amenable at this stage. I mean, it's pretty well documented. Robert Kraft as well as a big rugby fan. And he's quite open about that. So I think we do it early enough, we get it locked in enough, then there's certainly opportunities for flexibility. I think when you look at, undoubtedly one of the reasons and triggers that make it easier for us to, look at 27, 29, 31 access to venues and some of the venue configurations that are going to be changed to meet very strict FIFA criteria. 26 from training venues, some of the smaller venues, and some of those big NFL venues are hopefully going to be more permanently adaptable. And
right.
The level of response from, and Jim alludes to, when we reached out asking for expressions of interest from cities and stadiums, we ended up with 50 odd cities. That initially were down to 30 odd that still, and their desire, and they filled in very detailed questionnaires, but their willingness and desire to be involved in this process was fantastic.
Good. Each men's 15s World Cup, they tend to use about 12 to 13 venues. France is using 9. Last time I checked, they cut it back, and I think they went to bigger stadiums. I think they feel that they can fill even for the lesser venues. I'm curious as to what you think about what a United States-based World Cup would look like if there would be. I mean, my thought was there would be more because you'd have to squeeze in some time. There might be 3 weeks to be able to use a certain stadium, and then you can't use it for a couple of weeks or something like that. But they're there. I mean, there are a lot of venues there.
I don't want to bore you with my old job, but part of the issue is that when you talk about windows of access to venues and clean venue criteria and the sort of requirement, it's not just Rugby World Cup, it's major events make on venues. So, bumping everything in, with all the signage, press tribunes, different IBC networks within that, it's all very expensive and very logistically difficult. And, being in a venue for a week, being out for a week back in that venue doesn't tend to work. So, and Rugby World Cup as an organisation has a number of cost implications with venue dressing inside the bowl as well, which is very expensive. So I think, if we end up with some of the innovations around a 24-team tournament, I think there is a little bit more potential for using a couple more venues. But I think, when it just wouldn't be economically or operationally viable to have too many venues in your stadium inventory come tournament time.
Okay, because as you said, you have to set up and tear down, and do all the work behind it. Okay, so that makes sense. One of the other things with the United States being so huge, the idea of regionalizing the tournament. Say you have the current format, which is 4 pools of 5. If you go a 24 team, are you doing 6 pools of 4 or 4 pools of 6? However you work it, you'd want to try and get teams in places where they would have a fan base. But that's pretty hard to do when you have a draw, right? It's pretty much a blind draw. You can't say, we'd really like Tonga to be in Pool C. I mean, it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it's always a conundrum. But I think regionalisation, there's also the argument that tends to happen. Some of the big draw teams, if you like, the All Blacks, England, South Africa. It's every city or every region wants one of them. Yeah. So, how much, and the US, the US to be restricted to play in one region, and historically with World Cups, the host union has tended to travel most to be able to give most access to those host country games. But you're right. I think that the general principle of creating, my first World Cup I was involved with in a country with a big land mass of Australia, we did that exactly with Perth, Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. Those as the hubs for each of the pools. So England and South Africa and Uruguay, and I can't remember who else were out in Perth. And they stayed there for the duration of the phase, and then we had these swap overs. So it's that makes common sense to at least have, if not all of them, the majority of pools playing in one regional area, and it tends to keep and build momentum in that region as well when you have that.
Okay. The possibility that any of these bids might be the Women's World Cup in 2029, the Women's 15s World Cup. It seems to me, it's one of those things like, really? The United States has never hosted this? Because this seemed to be something that could really be executed. No offense to anybody else who's done it, but better than anyone else has done it. Because you could, even if you say based it in California, you would have access to more venues and better places for it. Do you think? What do you think about that? Do you think that the USA could really do a good job with that?
100%, and obviously with our strong history in the tournament as past winners said, it's you look at how TV. It's a shame COVID sort of has cut that curve, but some of the attendances pre-COVID of games in France, TV viewing figures in England and France, that'll continue to grow. The likelihood is that 25 will potentially go back to the Northern Hemisphere, and probably in England or France to host it. And can we then kick on again in 29 and truly raise the bar with regards to the way women's sport is really embraced in the US, has been for far longer than other countries. The success of the soccer team, I have no doubt, and I think that's a strong argument for our bid for give us the opportunity to showcase both, using innovations, using regional concepts. I think if you look at New Zealand, they've got most of the tournament taking place in the north of New Zealand, moving down to Auckland for the final stages. I think we could really raise the bar with the women's edition without a doubt.
Absolutely. All right. Good. You've mentioned innovations. You talked about the potentially men's World Cup 24 teams, women's 16 teams, something like that. Are you thinking about a different format, or sort of more closer to the format that exists, just more teams?
I think the numbers of teams and how you play. It's weird how you get to make it fit within that sort of 6-week major event window. It's a classic Rubik cube. I think there are certain criteria when you're working with the right sets of even numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the issues that have been with the traditional men's model of the World Cup is with 20 teams, you end up with 4 pools of 5, which one team's not playing every match day. You've then got to move rest days. There's so much more awareness around player welfare now in games. If you've got an even number within pools, the flow of games, and the 20 to 24 is an interesting conundrum, and you move to those different groups, because the 6 groups of 4, you don't end up having to lengthen the hosting time frame of that 6 weeks.
Well, that's true. You're still playing pretty much the same number of pool matches, and then you go into your quarterfinals.
for more consistency and rest days between each pool playing, and so I think we'd love to get to really get into exploring that in more detail, but it's we've got plenty of work to do in the next period before we get potentially blessed with a hosting.
Right. So we can get later into the nitty gritty of tiebreakers for second place teams and pools, and how do you decide that, and bonus points and all that fun stuff. That we could spend a couple of years on that. You mentioned also risk, and I guess go back to the financial difficulties of the 2018-17 World Cup. The 2018 Sevens World Cup. What are some of the lessons from that? What are some of the things in terms of let's not get hit with a big bill after it. Let's have USA Rugby, American Rugby, end this in the black.
Yeah, a great question, and and that's obviously been at the forefront of the board's mind when we've been exploring these opportunities. Is how do we ensure that the union's annual P&L and operating is not affected? Yes, it could be great, but we know we don't have the resources currently to double team with this. Hence, the engagement of Jim and the team, supported by some of our key individuals as well. So I think that San Francisco was a big event, but it was a one-off. It was a one-off 3-day event over a week. It doesn't meet the major event criteria. I've said this publicly before, and I think we've talked about it, Alex, that the key lessons learned from my side were not doing that very, very early due diligence and locking in areas of support which were fundamental: venue hire agreements, hotel agreements, agreements with cities, and I don't think there's anyone particular, but it all happened a bit quickly. And I think there's a number of, even World Rugby have put their hands up and said, that should have been a more in-depth process at that stage. I think doing the feasibility study, going through the contractual discussions now, we've got venue hire templates from World Rugby now that we can get signed prior to an awarding. Even though it's a long runway out, we can get a number of key criteria locked in now that that really limit and mitigate a number of risks around it. We have the time to put proper financing structures in there, with potential private equity groups that make sense. There's a number of them now involved, investing billions of dollars in the sport around the world. World Rugby, always take more of a joint venture approach to World Cup's men and women than they do with a one-off event, which they put so much more responsibility just on the host union. So there are a huge number of mitigating factors. It's fundamentally a different model, and we have to do our groundwork first. And the overarching philosophy with this particular project is the union's not paying for any of the feasibility study costs. That's been allowed to happen to the level it's happened at. I'm not saying we couldn't have got ourselves to this stage with myself and a few other people, but it's been done to an incredibly high standard to ensure that we don't get caught out down the line. And the funding for that's been from a group of rugby stakeholders that, again, I think we've talked about before, with a couple of MLR owners led by Ryan Patterson, who's involved in San Diego, who's, I think, really enjoyed having a little bit of a hands-on and getting a better understanding of what this environment is as well, which he's obviously managed to communicate through stakeholders like the MLR, and what they're doing are going to be important. Uniting, the club environment, the collegiate environment. You yourself know that the issues there, the youth and high school. We've got councils in place that we really need to engage and activate around building the legacy aspects of this as we move forward, so that it's beneficial for all of us. And whatever we end up as a hosting entity, the union's annual business and the union structure will be 100% protected from the financial risk of that tournament. That's a given. World Rugby know that that's going to be the case. You know, they've obviously been through the pains of the bankruptcy with us to a degree and supporting us through that process. So they know warts and all of the nightmares we've been through. So
Sure.
I think, you know, we've got to get there. And, you know, before we formally submit that bid and you know, sign hosting agreements, you know, that next level of finance, structure and support and how our relationship's going to be contractually with World Rugby is going to be massively important.
Right. Good. Well, I mean, World Rugby. This is one of their, if not their main income producer, is the men's 15s World Cup. So they have to make sure it's successful. They can't just say, you know, put somebody on the rowboat and push them out and say, you know, make it happen. They're I mean, would it be fair to say that they're hugely invested in making sure that it's successful for everybody?
Without a doubt, and
Yeah.
you know, they as an organisation and you know the global rugby family will, you know, will benefit from the engagement levels that a major event like the Rugby World Cup will get in the US. You know, both in the build up and beyond. You know, they've alluded to that within their current strategic plan. You know, that they've just revamped and sent out. You've got Alan Gilpin, who's, you know, the new CEO that, you know, has Rugby World Cup at his heart. He had major events. He was involved with IMG when I was first working with World Rugby, and I worked with him on 2 World Cups. He then went off to the Olympics in London, and he's come back to World Rugby, and you know, he was head of Rugby World Cup, and now he's the CEO. So the driver of the organisation, you know, is obviously supportive, and the fact that, you know, out of these recent meetings that, you know, we've been, you know, nominated as a candidate and, you know, moving forward to the next phase is important.
All right, thanks again to our Patreon patrons and our anonymous patrons supporting Golf Rugby Report. You can get that support gets us content like this and allows us, in addition, to be able to put this kind of video everywhere we want rather than worrying about a paywall or something like that. You can just see it, but it depends on these patrons that you are seeing on the screen right now. Thanks a lot. See you next time.